Hi, I'm Janet Kelly, and I am the survivor of a long term marriage of domestic violence. Because of my experiences, I formed Seeking Peace Coaching to help other women. I am an advocate for women in destructive marriages. I coach women through the divorce process, and I am spending a lot of time educating about domestic violence and coercive control. This talk I'm giving today is on spiritual abuse, which is one form of domestic violence. Okay, so I spent 10 years as a church employee, and most of that as an administrator. So I kind of have a perspective on pastors and how they deal with abuse. My church helped me escape. And I did not realize that was a unicorn in most people's story about escaping domestic violence until I went to a retreat, a Christian organization called to Peace Ministries. They have recovery retreats once a year. And when I went the first time, there was one session I was in, and they were asking about pastors and how they responded to disclosures of abuse, and I was literally the only person in the room that was helped by their pastor. And so I realized this is a problem in our organizations. We need to educate about it. Called to Peace Ministry, when they surveyed their clients in 2018 and asked them, would you, if you had to do it all over again, would you tell your church and ask for help? And 70% of them said no, they would not ask their church for help. And so that's part of my advocacy, is helping churches do better in responding. When I got married in the 80s, there was nothing about high conflict personalities or narcissistic personality disorder. I didn't even know what domestic violence was. Rarely do pastors even today preach about it. But according to the CDC and the U.S. Department of Justice, about 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men are in a relationship with domestic violence, having intimate partner violence. And women represent about 75% of the victims. So when I'm talking, I'm going to talk about the woman being the victim and the man being the perpetrator. I realize it goes both ways, but it's just more common in this way. And then Lifeway itself did its own research in 2018 and found that 37% of women sitting in church are having intimate partner violence in their marriage. So that's a huge, huge portion of people. So what I want to talk today about is defining coercive control. This word is going to be seen more and more as you study domestic violence. Then I want to talk about spiritual abuse by the perpetrator, spiritual abuse by the institution, signs of spiritual abuse, and then resources for victims and counselors. So coercive control is actually illegal in the United Kingdom, Australia, Queensland. In the United States, South Carolina this year was the first state to bring legislation up against coercive control. Here is the definition from Australia, and they kind of give direction on where I'm going to go as I talk about this. The national principles recognize that coercive control is almost always an underpinning dynamic of family and domestic violence. Coercive control involves perpetrators using patterns of abusive behaviors over time in a way that creates fear and denies liberty and autonomy. People who use coercive control may use physical and non-physical abusive behaviors, or a combination of both. All abusive behaviors are serious. Coercive control has traumatic and pervasive immediate and long-term impacts on victim survivors, their families, and communities. The signs of coercive control can be difficult to spot. People who use coercive control can use many different types of abusive behaviors to exert power and dominance, Behaviors can be subtle and insidious and individually targeted and tailored to the victim survivor. So I think understanding coercive control is key when you're dealing with people in abuse. You know, the thing that I like about the term coercive control is that it applies to all forms of abuse. For example, in child abuse, you know, pedophiles and abusers might say, I'm going to kill your dog if you tell anybody. That is coercive control. Senior abuse, I'm not going to let you see your grandson if you don't give me the money. That is coercive control. And then cults, if you leave us, now that we've isolated you from everybody you know, you'll be destitute, you'll be alone, you'll have nobody. And then domestic violence is right here in the middle, and it's people that are doing it to their intimate partner. So it's intimate partner violence, the children are watching it, and about 60% of children in that situation are also being abused, since they do coercive control on everybody. The first thing I want to talk about is the abuse on the person, it's the spiritual abuse. And of course, perpetrators use scripture to coercively control their victims. The first one is, wives, submit to your husbands, from Ephesians 5:22. And it's done in a way that demands obedience without love, without safety, without respect. It really doesn't matter if you're complementarian or egalitarian in your beliefs about marriage. Be a decent human being. Just be a decent human being. Treat people with respect. The pastors that helped me escape my marriage were complementarian, but they told me things like, I had never heard one human being speak to another human being like that. So they recognized that there was something completely wrong with what I was dealing with. The second biggest one is God hates divorce. This is used to keep people trapped because they think that they have to catch them in adultery. Adultery is the only reason. And perpetrators are extremely covert, especially if they're hiding in the church. They don't want people to know they're committing adultery, so they don't let their spouse know. And this verse is often used, and it's actually misquoted, because if you read Malachi chapter 2, he is saying God hates the violence that causes divorce. And he even says prior to this verse that he doesn't listen to the prayers of the men who commit these acts. So that's a total twisting of scriptures. Another thing is misunderstanding of covenants. Not realizing that abuse breaks the marriage covenant by not allowing safety in the marriage. A great book that explains all of this is The Life-Saving Divorce by Gretchen Baskerville. She goes back to the Jewish marriage covenant, even showing, pictures of scrolls, and it included emotional support, physical support, medical support, all the things that abusers deny their spouses were written out in the marriage covenant in Jewish times. So that's a really good resource if they're confused about breaking a covenant. A lot of times women think, well, I don't want to be the one to file for divorce with the state because I'm bringing the state into a personal matter, but you went to the state to get a license to get married. So if you're acknowledging the fact that it's already been broken and you're updating the state record when you get a divorce, it's a different way to think about it, but people get trapped in those ideas. The third thing that abusers do is they bring God into your marriage and triangulate him, saying, God told me to tell you X, Y, and Z, and it's something they want you to do. Has nothing to do with God. One person was told by her spouse that he would get leprosy if he had an affair with the woman that he was publicly being accused of having an affair with. And, it was very confusing to her because, like, how's he going to get leprosy in the United States? That's a crazy thing for God to tell him. And then, honestly, in some ways, he probably got leprosy of the heart because he had a heart of stone and the flesh had fallen off. Misuse of Scripture to define suffering for Christ. A very big problem in keeping women stuck in domestic violence is a misunderstanding of suffering. Women in that situation think this is just my cross to bear. Jesus told me to pick up my cross and follow me, and I'm keeping it together, I'm staying together, I'm staying for the kids. They make all these reasons and they suffer through it. But Jesus never intended for us to keep ourselves in a place where you had external suffering. We may suffer for bringing justice because God is a God of justice, and it's often dangerous to speak out against injustice. But suffering is not a virtue. A good resource on this is Diane Langberg's Suffering in the Heart of God. It's a big book, but it really gives you a clear understanding of God's heart about suffering. And some women are told, stay and win him over with your gentle and quiet spirit from 1 Peter 3:1. And a wolf, if Jesus Christ dying on the cross isn't changing his heart, your gentle and quiet spirit isn't going to change his heart. I mean, it is a God work to change someone's heart. So that just traps them. Silencing with Scripture. There's so many ways people are silenced with Scripture. Being told to pray more, don't talk about it. You should be praying more instead of seeking practical help. Sadly, the two most things told to women by pastors when they go for help: pray more, have more sex. Those are the two most common things pastors tell women in domestic violence. That it's a way of silencing you. Like, don't talk about it, just do these things instead. Another way women are silenced is they're being shamed for speaking up about their mistreatment. They're being told, you're gossiping, you're bitter, you have a critical spirit, you need to forgive. One woman who, her spouse, what he did to her was every time they had a new pastor, the pastor could have been young enough to be her son or old enough to be her dad. If she ever talked about, she was in a meeting and they joked about X or whatever, he would claim that she had an inappropriate relationship with the pastor. And so it made her never talk to the pastor because she didn't want her husband to come against him. She didn't want him to do anything bad to her pastor. So she felt like she was protecting the pastor by not talking to him. Another thing they do is they will tell you not to keep a record of wrongs. So if they figure out you're writing about the abuse in your prayer journal, which should be recommended because that's a great way to undo gaslighting. If you write it down in your journal and then he claims it never happened a week later, you can read your journal and get reality back. So documenting stuff in your journal is really good for helping you recover sanity and clarity. Sin leveling, that's when your abuser tells you your sin is just as bad as mine. Who are you to tell me? You shouldn't judge me. Being told that you can't tell the family about it because then you're violating the leave and cleave scripture. That's one thing abusers use. And the second part of all this that I wanted to talk about is the institutional betrayal. Because first you've got your intimate partner predator doing all these things to you, and depending on what stage you're in when you go for help, it will actually change how you respond to them if you don't understand it. Like if a person comes in the very beginning for help, they're going to say, I am really confused. I don't know what's going on, because of that clarity loss through gaslighting and love bombing and all those tactics that coercive controllers use to destabilize you. But if they're in the second phase where they're starting to realize, wait a minute, I think he's purposely doing these things, then they're mad and they're pissed off, and they come to you and they're dysregulated now because they're really mad. But it's just a part of the process of escaping a predator. And so just think about that when people come to you, that if they're in the confused stage, they haven't reached the anger stage, and they will get there. So institutional betrayal is when a victim survivor reaches out to get help from church leadership and she's treated poorly. All denominations are set up differently. Some require you to write out everything he's done and let the elder board read over it and decide if you get permission to get a divorce. And some of the things that I've seen is where they have described marital rape, they have described physical acts of violence, and those 12 men get together and decide they can't get a divorce. They're going to be excommunicated. So a lot of women believe this secondary trauma is worse because they had high hopes for support and compassion from their pastoral leadership. Sometimes they were in the church long before their predator joined, and they are basically rejected. And so when they believe the abuser, when they can't see that they themselves have been groomed, because this is the thing about coercive controllers. They look at everybody as an object to manipulate. Every single person. Either you're going to be an object to be a victim, or you're going to be an object manipulated to be a character witness. So they're doing both things at once. They're manipulating people to think they're a good guy. They're manipulating people and victimizing them. Because most of the women that are Christian, that are caught in these marriages, they are part of the cover story for the predator. They make him look good. They make him look like a normal human being to the public. But he's grooming people to think he's a great guy. And then he could have 2 other lives going in the background. And so if she figures it out, these people will go like, certainly not. I wouldn't have made him a deacon if I had known he was doing that. So it's all deliberate. It's all deliberate. That's the hardest. I think that's the big jump right there. When you can see that it's deliberate, that healing comes with the truth. The truth brings horror, but then it brings healing. You know, of course, women are encouraged by the church to keep the family unity at all costs. But abuse is never a marital problem. It's a personal problem for the abuser. I never ever recommend marriage counseling when abuse is present, because there's only one person going for the counseling, and that's the victim. The abuser is showing up to gain intel, to understand how to harm them more, to hear what they're saying about them to the outside world. And they're using that information to continue their deception. As Diane Langberg says, these people have habituated deceit. They've habituated deceit. They're just lying all the time. The people in the marriage are always more important than the institution of marriage. And of course, the children in these families are watching. They're watching how their moms are being treated by the church. They're watching how their moms are being treated in family court. They themselves are they're collecting ACEs from day one. Some of them in the womb are collecting ACEs that they have to deal with for the rest of their lives. There is a podcast by Dr. Christina Cocciola called perfect prey. And she interviews children, young adults, 18 and up, that have gone through the family court system, have been raised with a parent that is probably diagnosed with something, but an abuser. And they talk about how it affected them and the lies that they were told. And sometimes it took 10 years for them to figure out. Their mom never abandoned them, that the court just gave the dad custody, because he was, that's the thing. A lot of times these guys get custody because they're putting on an act every single day of their life. And when they walk into a courtroom, they're still in mode and they're putting on an act. And the mom is on the other side completely losing it, because she realizes she's losing custody of her kids, and she looks dysregulated. He looks in control. And the court hands the kids to the abuser. So that's a whole different topic. Predators like churches where they can plug into leadership. Shannon Thomas, in her book, Healing from Hidden Abuse, she talks about how they procure a stellar public reputation. They get on boards, they get on the church board, they become deacons, they teach Sunday school, they pass out Gideon Bibles, whatever it is that they can do to create this image that they hope is stronger than the truth, if the truth ever comes out, that will protect them from accountability. Weaponizing forgiveness. This is something that I'm surprised people don't understand the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, but it's pretty common to see people demand that you forgive him. He said he's sorry, but then there is absolutely no evidence of change. So forgiveness is something for you yourself to do. It may not be safe to tell the other person that you forgave them, and you may never talk to them again. But forgiveness doesn't mean no boundaries, no accountability, no justice. Unconditional love doesn't mean unconditional relationship. Hearing if you were really a Christian, and that is used to manipulate you. Reconciliation is something that can only be done after they have sought forgiveness, they have made restitution, and they have slowly shown a change in behavior over time. Since these predators use coercive control to manipulate their victims, Leslie Vernick, she says that there are times where the guy will say, "I'm sorry," and start acting good and be good for about 2 years. And then that comes back out again, right? Their regular behavior. But, you've wasted 2 years of your life in some ways, if it's not real. But if that's what they need to do, that's what they will do. They are thinking of every person as like, how do I get what I need from them? The effects of spiritual abuse, erosion of faith in God, and creating a mini cult family. So here's some other things. Feeling like your faith is tied to your abuser, like if you walk away from, you're walking away from God, if you walk away from him. Being completely confused with the Bible, because the Bible's being used to keep you in bondage, but it has all these verses about freedom and protection and love and justice, and you're not getting any of that in the house. Losing trust in church leaders because they didn't help you or protect you. Makes people think they can't hear from God because the voice of their abuser is just in their head constantly. Thinking God is transactional and manipulative just like their abuser is. And that's really a hard one for children that grow up in this situation to realize that God is not transactional. They thought this was God's will for their life, and now it's gone. So there's a lot of grief that's involved with that. And then Scott McKnight, he wrote The Church Called Tav, and he gave a really good speech at the Restore conference. And in it, he talked about the de-churched. And he said, these women that are in abusive marriages and go to their church for help and that church doesn't help them, he says they are following Jesus out the back door of their church. They never leave Jesus. They just leave institutional religion. And I think it's kind of interesting because in Australia they call homeschooling deschooling. You're giving up the institutional school and you're doing it yourself. So the de-churched they're giving up the institutional church and doing it themselves. But the number of women, I want to say it's like 96% of those that left evangelical churches are women. And it's 2.5 million people call themselves de-churched right now in a Pew Research study that they just did. And of that, over 90% is women. How do we respond biblically to abuse? Do not overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. Do not be overcome. And then Leslie Vernick always has these 4 scriptures, which I appreciate her. It's good to protect yourself from violent people. It's good to expose deeds done in darkness. It's good to speak the truth in love. It's good for someone to experience the consequences of his or her behavior. One thing for me that I see as I talk with survivors and stuff is like, as a Christian woman, you think you're suffering for God, but what is going with that is you trying to diagnose this guy. You're like, does he have borderline? Does he have narcissism? Is he bipolar? Does he have ADHD? You're going through all these things, but it never occurs to you that it's deliberate. You're applying a normal person's brain thinking to an individual who may not have a conscience. Like Dr. Martha Stout says, 1 in 25 is walking around without a conscience. And they don't want you to know they don't have a conscience. Everybody said Ted Bundy was a great guy that knew him as a normal person, but he didn't have a conscience. So, applying that to your spouse is really hard to do because you're like, it's terrifying because you think back of the past and you think about these accidents and you're just like, oh my gosh. But it also propels you into healing because you're like, okay, if this is deliberate, then I have to totally take a different track in escaping and getting out. And I had different people ask me questions that helped me understand that it was deliberate. The easiest one to ask is like, if he's throwing and breaking stuff, say, is he breaking his things? Because usually they're not throwing their own things. It does take time, especially, like I was married for 35 years, but I started planning my exit 3 years before I filed for divorce. I waited until my last child graduated. I was not going to drag my kids through family court. I thought it'd be 50-50 custody, and that wasn't acceptable because that meant I wasn't there half the time, to protect my kids. I wasn't going to do that. And the family court is a whole different way that people are betrayed. Thank you for listening today. Again, this is Janet Kelly from Seeking Peace Coaching. You can find me on my website, www.seekingpeacecoaching.com. I'm also on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Let me know if I can serve you in any way. I'm also available to educate on domestic violence. Thank you and be blessed.